So I'm really pleased that our two presenters were willing to step up and talk about some of the things they've been working on and thinking about to sort of open up this conversation. And our two presenters, we have Peter Hayes and Dean Moberg. Peter and his family own and care for family forests in Northern Oregon Coast Range, known as the Hyla Woods. And since 1986, 3 generations have been actively exploring what's required to shape forests that are ecologically complex, economically viable, and useful to the wider community. And so beyond forests, Peter's involvement also includes past service on Oregon's Board of Forestry, leadership of the Build Local Alliance, and involvement with forest-related education and service on various nonprofit boards. We're lucky enough to have Peter on the board of the Forest Stewards Guild. Our second presenter, Dean Moberg, has a Bachelor of Science in Plant Science from the University of California, Davis, and got an MA in teaching from Cornell, as well as a PhD in environmental science and engineering from Oregon Health and Science University. So we're all over the place, bringing a good smattering of experiences. He's retired after 35 years with the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Oregon. And he now serves as the elected director of the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District in Northwest Oregon. So glad to have both of you. And before we dive into the main part of our presentation, I'm going to see if I can steal the screen here and just mention a little bit about the Forest Stewards Guild. Forest Stewards Guild hosting today's webinar, and we are a national nonprofit. I sit here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, but we have members all across the country and do projects out of a few regional offices across the country. Our focus is that triple bottom line: ecologically, economically, and socially responsible forestry. And that looks very different in different places across the country. And that, to me, is the exciting part, figuring out how to implement this kind of forestry. And it's always complex because of this triple bottom line and because of the ecological specificity that is required to do it right. And so we have to bring in rigorous science, as well as that place-based experience that many of you on today's call bring to the table. That knowledge from working on the land and connecting with landowners or on your own land is so crucial to understanding how to actually achieve this triple bottom line. We're really invested in working with communities, rather than just thinking about the forest as a totally separate element. It's really integrated into human communities. In some cases, that looks like community forests or community woodland utilization. Where I sit, it often looks like community wildfire protection plans. So there are a lot of different ways communities interact with forests. And one of those key ways for us is the next generation. And so we think a lot about who will be the future stewards of our forests, of our natural resources. And so we have a lot of different programs to engage students and early career professionals to bring them into the Guild and provide opportunities and examples for what we feel is the kind of forestry that we need to take into the next century. So with that, I will wrap up and Dean, ask you to share your screen again. Right now we have participants muted with the idea of trying to keep the sort of channel clear so that we can hear our presenters, and we are recording so that if you have a colleague who may have missed this presentation and would like to see it in the future, that this is an opportunity for them, or if you missed something, you can go back and listen to the recording. Feel free to type questions in the chat window. We will have time for discussion at the end, but if you have a question as we go, put it in there now, and that way we will know, sort of what's queued up. Yes, and thank you, Laura, for pointing out. Dean, we are in presenter mode, so you do want to make that switch to the presentation mode here as we get started. Great. And I think we're ready to go. So with that, I will turn it over to Peter Hayes and Dean Moberg. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Xander, and thank you to you and the Guild for hosting this and inviting us to join you. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. It's fun to see a lot of familiar names. And I think, Xander, you had the idea of inviting people to type into the chat where they are, just so we have a sense of the geographic span if people are up for doing that. So people all across this continent and across the world are wrestling with all sorts of questions related to climate and forests. And we hope in our own very small way to make a contribution to that conversation. We have a lot to learn, and the best part about today will probably be the conversation from my point of view. And a little background is decades of work have been done in Oregon on forests and climate change. It's stepped up significantly recently, and three things were important in that change. One was a governor's executive order focusing on climate change in March of 2020. That was followed in August of 2021 by our Oregon Global Warming Commission creating a natural and working lands proposal, and was followed soon after in November of 2021 by the Department of Forestry and the Board of Forestry creating and adopting a climate change and carbon plan. So all of these are important and ambitious. They each have many strengths, but I think we're going to argue they have one weakness, and we'll describe what we see as that weakness and part of how that motivated us. So we're going to share just a brief summary of an ongoing project that aims to help address that weakness and to accelerate a transition towards what we would call climate smarter forestry. And to be clear from the beginning, this is a small, humble, and imprecise project working to support and advance much wider sweep of good work. And I think Xander was going to put in, we have a report that summarizes more completely than we will today this work. And we'll put a link in the chat if you want to go and check that out. You can go ahead, Dean, when you're ready. Dean's the driver, as you probably have figured out. So, of course, we'll give you an idea of where we're headed. So kind of an overview, and it's fairly logical. We're setting the stage here at the beginning. I'll do that. Then we'll talk about the workshop's structure, what we actually did. And 3 will be what we learned, the results. That leads to next steps. And then the last part of our time together will be a discussion. And for setting the stage, I think an easy way to do it is to characterize this as something that started as a request and got a little out of control. So about 2 years ago, a young person who's an activist in climate forest issues pointed out that she thought that there was a lot that was really great that was happening in the state, but too often it wasn't grounded in the practical realities of day-to-day forest management. So her question is, could I and a group of colleagues come visit in the forest? And I said, of course. And that really led to where we are now, to this project. The second one, which was a question, is not long after that, I was in the office with Scott Gray, who was the head of Western Lands for Stimson Lumber Company. And he raised the question, first he made the statement, climate and forest really matters to me and to this company. And he said, wouldn't it be great if we could have a forthright, science-based, non-posturing, relaxed conversation about this? So that question combined with the request. And then the third one was, I heard from a number of people as they worked on the different documents that I described, is this desire of how do we put more flesh on the bones? What does this really mean? How do we walk the talk? And then finally is a realization that I had, we can go next one, Dean, was that an observation that if you go around Oregon and talk to forest related people and say, what do you think of climate smart forestry or smarter forestry? It's very hard to find someone who'll say, well, that's a bad idea. So it's sort of like save the whales. The Venn diagram is all overlapping. And then the other thing I noticed was at times, if you said, well, what does that mean? The Venn diagram didn't overlap so well. So at the extremes could be somebody say, the answer is we just never cut any more trees. Or another answer could be we just carry on because we've always conducted climate smarter forestry, get with it. So that really raised this question of what does that Venn diagram look like? Where's the common ground and how could we put that to use? So to be clear about our purposes, the first one is just to provide a unique learning experience. And most of that came from people listening to and learning from one another. Second one is to bring together a very diverse group of people involved with forests in Oregon and have a community of learners learning together. Obviously, a key focus is back to the Venn diagram. Where is the common ground and how could we best work together to put that to good use? And that would balance with one which is to respectfully explore uncommon ground, that people are not going to agree on everything. And we need to understand that and figure out how we work with that. And all of this really leads to that final purpose, which is commitments have been made. People are determined. What are we going to do to accelerate the transition towards climate smarter forestry? And when people arrived, we presented a North Star, an idea. And the way it looked is times along the bottom, amount is up the y-axis. And it was a vision of if in 5 or 10 years we could say that over time, let's pretend the green line is this one, the amount of carbon stored per acre in forests in Oregon continued to increase. The second line could be the level of resilience to climate stresses increased over time. And the third one was that opportunities and vitality for rural forest dependent communities would increase. We never gave people a chance to either endorse this or not. So we're not pretending that they all embraced it, but it was sort of what we call kind of the North Star. And a key to this is kind of a central hypothesis is that there really are two forms of action. One is direct innovation in terms of forest management. And the second one would be a whole set of other important actions that enable that direct change. And a point that we really stressed was really group number one is what's going to move those lines. Group number two is important, but they're only important as a means to an end to moving that line. So that's going to be a through line through our conversation today, is how do we change the behavior of those of us who make responsible decisions on the ground. Now I'll turn it over to Dean.
Thank you, Peter. And also thank you, Xander and Forest Stewards Guild. It's good to be here with you today. We appreciate the opportunity. So the workshops were held in the Hyla Woods Mount Richmond Forest, which is a forest about 20 miles west of Portland, Oregon, in the Northern Oregon Coast Range. It's a 750-acre forest that Peter and his family have been managing for past 2 decades with a priority on climate resilience and carbon and climate mitigation. We held 4 workshops and we invited 4 what we called sectors of people to those workshops. And these are the sectors here. There was a design build sector that we call them. They were mostly architects and architecture academics, teachers of architecture in college. There was a group that we called the general group, which were agency staff and officials, mostly people who are on Oregon's Board of Forestry. There was a group that we called the practitioners, who were woodland owners. There was one representative from industrial forest company, and then forestry consultants. And then finally, the last workshop was a group of nonprofits, we call nonprofits or advocates. They were mostly organizations that I think most of us would think of as sort of environmentally oriented organizations. So each workshop had a separate sector of people who participated, although there was a little bit of cross-pollination because sometimes people who were invited to one workshop couldn't make that date, so they went over into a different workshop. But pretty much 4 workshops, 4 sectors of people. All together, we had 66 participants, so each workshop averaged about 15 people, which was about right for the kind of structure that we had set up. So we met in the beginning of each workshop down sort of at the lower elevation in the forest and had some introductions. And then we carpooled and caravanned up to a higher elevation in the forest, and we had multiple stops through the forest. So at the first stop, we had a little bit of quiet time in the forest, and then we had lunch, and we asked people to explain why they came. Why did they want to participate in these series of workshops? Peter talked a little bit about the history of the place and even importantly, the prehistory of the forest. And then we showed the participants 7 different strategies for how to help Western Oregon forests adapt to a changing climate. We asked the participants if they had any other strategies to suggest, and they didn't. So then we asked them to rate those strategies on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 meaning it's a great, very important strategy for adapting to climate change, 1 meaning it's a terrible strategy, and very much like, say, like a Yelp rating for a restaurant would be with 1 to 5 stars. Then we got back in the vehicles, carpooled and caravan down the forest road to a next stop in the forest, where we presented another 7 strategies. And these 7 were for climate mitigation. So specifically how to help Oregon forests sequester more carbon in vegetation and in the soil. And the participants again rated those 7 strategies on a scale of 1 to 5. Got back in the vehicles again, went down the road to another stop in the forest, and we asked the participants to talk about barriers that they saw to these different strategies, and also suggest solutions to overcome those barriers. So again, there's 7 mitigation strategies, 7 adaptation strategies, a total of 14. And in the report that we've written up, we give the results for all 14 strategies. Here, because of time concerns, I'm only going to show the results for a few of them. So these are the results for what we call strategy M1, M standing for mitigation. And this was to keep the forest in forest, which was basically, we explained that the strategy would be to reduce the conversion of forest land to other land uses. And you can see here that most of the participants in each of the 4 different groups rated this strategy as important, with an average rating of 4.6 out of 5. That was the best rating that we saw out of all the strategies. And the results didn't differ very much from one group to another. Most people in all 4 groups gave this strategy a 4 or a 5, meaning that it's an important part of climate mitigation in Western Oregon forests. As you can see, though, not everybody agreed. Here was one person in the practitioner group, that's the forestry consultants and the forest owners, who rated this low. And sometimes when somebody had a rating that was a little bit different than everybody else, we asked them to explain what they were thinking, not to have a debate over it. We tried very hard to avoid debates, but just so that we could understand what their thinking was. I don't think, Peter, we asked this person, I don't remember who it was, I don't think we asked them to explain their vote, but possibly it was because they thought the rate of forest land conversion to other land uses in Western Oregon is not very high, so it's not that important because of that. Possibly they thought this was private property issue, that people should be able to control what they did with their own forest land, and it wasn't up to any agency or organization to say otherwise. Here's a result for strategy A1, A meaning adaptation to climate change, and this was wildfire risk, which we defined as reducing the incidence, severity, and extent of catastrophic forest fires. And we were careful to point out when we introduced the strategy that we were not talking about prescribed burns, we were talking about wildfire. And it was very, I think it was surprising to both Peter and me that we had such a diversity of opinions on this, with the average rating of only 3.6, so kind of average of sort of only modestly important, if that, with ratings really varying all across the board in the different sectors of participants who were there. Possibly the general group, which again was the agency staff and agency officials, thought that reducing the risk of wildfire was an important strategy. And at the other end of the spectrum, possibly the advocates and nonprofits thought that it was less of an important strategy. But interestingly, that there was such a diversity of opinion on this, and that there were so many votes down in the lower end of saying that this was not that important of a strategy for helping forests adapt. This is a different kind of a rating schedule system that we used, which I thought was really interesting. So we call this a double access question, where we asked the participants at one stop to think about carbon offset trading and whether that was a good strategy for helping to incentivize climate smarter forestry. And so every participant had a little wooden disc, and we laid 2 ropes down on the forest floor perpendicular to each other. And we said, if you lay your disc in the upper quadrants, that means that you think that
Who are you talking to?
Myself.
that means that you think that carbon offset trading is an important. There's somebody who's not muted. I think that would be. Thank you. So if you laid your disc in the upper quadrants of this above the horizontal line, that meant that you think that carbon offset trading is an important strategy to helping with climate smarter forestry. Lower quadrants meant you think it's not a good strategy. If you lay your disc to the right-hand quadrants, it means that you think you have adequate knowledge to answer that question, and the left side would be you don't have adequate knowledge. And here's where I think the difference between the groups is really interesting. So in the general group, again, agency officials and staff generally felt that they had enough information to answer that question. Generally, they felt that it was an important strategy. On the other hand, down in the lower right there, you see in the red oval, the nonprofits, again, they also thought that they had enough information to answer that question, but they generally were more skeptical. I mean, mostly felt that offset trading was not a good strategy for climate smarter forestry. The practitioner groups, maybe a little bit more cautious. Their discs got laid kind of closer to the origin, meaning they didn't have such strong opinions, but generally speaking, they felt like most of them had enough knowledge to answer the question, and they were generally positive towards it, although there were 2 people in that group who thought carbon offset trading was a bad strategy. And interestingly, the design build, these are the architects, they were sort of all over the place with 3 or 4 discs in each of the 4 quadrants, meaning they very diverse opinions and levels of knowledge on carbon offset trading. Again, at our last stop in the tour, the visit to the forests, we asked the participants to talk about barriers to the strategies, both adaptation and mitigation, and then to also propose potential solutions to those barriers. And the solutions sorted out. There are a lot of these that are detailed more in the report that we've provided and written up, but they sort out into basically 7 different categories. One is, and this is in no particular order of importance, but one solution is collaboration. For an example of that is that we need to work together in ways that don't harm the least advantaged among us. Second is direct financial incentives. This is providing funds for easements and for adoption of climate smarter forestry practices, either through local, federal, state, or nonprofit funding mechanisms. Third is education and communication. Again, here the architect sector had an interesting thought. They said that they think that it would have been helpful in their college education to have some effort given to teaching them about different kinds of wood and how it's produced and choices that they have in buying wood for building projects. Labor and technology was important. An example here is to incentivize a forestry workforce, which might be the people actually going out and doing thinning in forests, but it also might be people working in nurseries, so that we've got a good skilled workforce going into the future. Fifth is markets, and people had ideas both in terms of kind of both sides, the supply and the demand side of the market. So for the supply side, they thought we need lumber mills that can process larger logs and more diverse species. And for the demand side, they thought it would be helpful to have a way of identifying wood that was grown with climate smarter forestry practices, so that consumers could make more knowledgeable choices about the wood that they buy. Sixth was public policy, basically either land use laws or tax policy. And seventh was research. And having worked for 35 years for the Natural Resources Conservation Service, formerly Soil Conservation Service, I was happy to see that the research that most people were pointing at was we need to know more about forest soils. And Peter, I think we're back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Dean. So a lot of the focus obviously was what was the common ground, but we should also be clear on what some of the uncommon ground is. And before doing that, a piece that I actually missed early on was we were surprised by the level of energy, engagement, and commitment that people brought to this. And I think there were maybe three things that might account for that. One is, I think not everybody, but many have a real sense of urgency around this topic. The second one is people were hungry to ground this in the realities of an actual forest. And the third one was the rich range of perspectives that we engaged from people all across the political and landscape spectrum. And so I think that really helped. So one way to look at the uncommon ground are what we could call these basic dilemmas. And we'll just highlight three, and there are more than three. One is there are differing desires, particularly in the marketplace. Many of the architects that we had engaged had strong ideas about what kind of wood they wanted to specify and use. And one of the dilemmas is some forest owners provide wood that meets that specification, but many do not. And many of the forest owners were uncomfortable with the idea of markets encouraging them to do things differently. The second one is relative emphasis on adaptation versus mitigation. Some landowners felt like adaptation was their top priority and mitigation they weren't so sure of. And in some cases, it was the opposite. So that was a dilemma that I think we can easily live with. And the third one we had was, as Dean pointed out with the XY graph, is offsets are an important part of possible market mechanisms. And there's some pretty strong and not uninformed differences of opinion on that topic. So a thing that we thought was important is if you look at the graphs we showed so far, it shows input from a wide range of people. But I want to take us back to that North Star little conceptual graph and the idea that if we're really going to move those lines, it's all about the practitioners and our ability to change our behavior on the ground. So with the help of a merging group who helped put the report together, we came up with an idea to go back to the practitioners and dig in more deeply. So we did a second round of questioning with them, and it involved 8 family forest people, 6 consulting foresters, 2 people working with forests for land trusts, and Region 6 of the Forest Service got involved and made some general assumptions. And the exercise we gave them was to say, let's make this very real. Pick a specific project that you think is representative of the work that you do in the forest. And then we asked them a series of questions. One of them was to take all of these, and there are now 17 strategies because we added these 3 at the bottom because we didn't have time during the sessions, and asked them to pick the 4 top ones. What was most important? So I think what's important here is to see what they rated highest was catching and holding carbon in the forest and finding a way to move away from dependence on fossil fuel in our operations. And then tied for 3rd, 4th, and 5th places was increasing the complexity of our forests learning more about assisted migration, and finding ways to limit loss of carbon through logging. So in a second here, what we're interested in is, if these are our top priorities, then how feasible is it for people to pursue those? So our next exercise, we can change, Dean, was to do this. With each of the 17 strategies, we asked them to put them in one of 4 categories. Green meant it's feasible. I can do this. There are no significant barriers. Yellow represented this is somewhat feasible, but I'm limited because of barriers. Orange meant I would like to do this. This is appropriate, but it is not currently feasible. And red is this is not applicable in my situation. And some of the reds that you'll see show up here are because people said, this is my specific job. So for instance, adding more land really was not applicable there. So you can see that the forest complexity, there's a lot of room for improvement. We keep going, Dean. And catching and holding in carbon, a lot of people felt there is some feasibility, but we have a lot of distance we could go there. And these last ones, clearly people felt like there's no green light here. So then a key question is, if we want to move those graphs, if we want to realize that vision, we have to be turning the oranges and the yellows into greens, which really leads us back to what Dean was talking about. What are the barriers and what are the solutions to removing those barriers? So next we're going to talk about a few of the next steps we're taking, and then we're going to present 3 opportunities that we'd like to highlight. So the first step is a fairly obvious one, is we created the report, we shared it with all the participants and anybody else who will listen, and asked them to go out and talk to their tribes, their communities of people, and discuss this, get feedback, feed that back into the system. And at the same time, we're doing a range of additional presentations like this one and having ongoing discussions without any clear idea of where this will go in the future. And we see really 3 opportunities that we hope together we can find a way to take advantage of. One is, if we know what we want to do and how we want to do it, and good things happening, but we need to accelerate that, why not pull together key representatives from the entities that have the most leadership responsibility, have them look at the needs and the possible solutions and pool their commitments. What are you doing? What would you like to commit to doing? Where is there overlap and potential to work together? Where are there gaps? So an opportunity we see would be to find a way to pull those people together, reflecting on this and other related information, and figure out how we accelerate the transition. The second one that we feel strongly about is the importance of meeting forest owners where we are. And there are 2 dimensions of that. One is that there are some forest owners for whom this is not a priority. And I think it's really important to not push any of this work on those people. Some of them would say increasing resilience is just a pragmatic move, but the mitigation is not my deal. So I think finding a way to use voluntary incentives to help people explore how to make things more feasible so they'd like to do it. The second dimension of this is, for decades, there are many forest owners in this state for whom this has been a high priority. And I think that it behooves us to figure out how to find those people, understand their work, listen to them, and find a way to encourage their success. And the third opportunity we're seeing is this. We had a great group of people, 66 people who were brought very diverse experiences and priorities. So the question is this like a cloud that formed and then will just dissipate? Or do we want to take the clue that we have from them saying they'd like to continue to work together? How can we use that as a nucleus, keep building on it? So perhaps create something like an Oregon Climate Smarter Forestry Network that would keep the work going on. So a few thoughts on conclusions is 3 things. One is a reminder of what I said at the beginning. This is a small, humble, imprecise project, and we'd be excited to see it have legs and learn more about these questions. The second one is, I think we've all heard this said before, but I think we know where we need to go. We have some good ideas of how we can get there and what steps will be required. And a really obvious question is, do we have the will to do what we need to do? And the last bit is just thanks back to Xander and the Guild and to all of you for participating. And this will be a rich conversation because many of you are involved in similar work happening all around the country. So I think with that, we'll turn it back to Xander and take any questions and comments and discussions. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you both. And we don't have any questions or comments yet in the chat window. And I guess we'll go ahead and allow participants to unmute themselves. So you can also go ahead and unmute and speak your question out loud. And I know looking at this list, I recognize some names, and I know, oh, good. Lindsay has a question. What are some of the trusted entities for forest owners for fostering further conversations or actions? That's a great question.
I can take a stab at that unless you want to, Dean.
Well, I would say, first of all, that I'm, as Xander said in the introduction, I'm a director of the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District. There are conservation districts in every state in the country and every county in the country, and they typically are elected officials who represent people, and forest owners typically trust conservation districts. So I think that would be a great avenue for having some of these conversations.
I think the thing I'd add to that, it depends on what you want to talk about, is I think within these subgroups, we have plenty of like professional organizations and pieces like that. But a common refrain that we heard was, why aren't we talking to the other people? Like with these 4 sectors, one idea is we could have mixed everyone together and put them together, and that would have been valuable in a whole different way. So I think we've got vehicles within the existing groupings, but often I think those become echo chambers of people talking to themselves. And my feeling is we don't really, and part of what motivated us to do this was we don't have adequate places for that cross-community dialogue. But Lindsay, great to see you there. And if you have thoughts, let's hear them. One question.
Oh, go ahead.
One question I'll throw in is, many of you, as I mentioned, have experiences in other parts of the country. So I'm wondering if we might ask Amanda to fill us in a bit on similarities and differences between this work and what's happening in New England or elsewhere.
I just added a spotlight to myself. I can mention, hi everybody, I'm Amanda. I work with Xander at the Forest Stewards Guild, but I'm over in Maine. And in my background, I'm at the top of a carbon flux tower at the Howland Research Forest in Howland, Maine. And this is part of a forest climate change initiative science and practice series. I'll just share in the chat if you're curious. So over in Maine, we have some similarities to Oregon and some really big differences. Our trees take a lot longer to grow, quite as big and beautiful as they do in Oregon. But we also have, a vibrant forest products industry. We have a long history of forest management and ecological forestry, and a lot of the same needs and impacts from climate change. So just in this series where I shared the link, the Forest Stewards Guild is teaming up with the University of Maine's Forest Climate Change Initiative, and during the pandemic, we kind of evolved our annual series into having a webinar on Wednesday and a field trip on Friday. And we're going to, and we're doing 4 of those every 2 months, and going to different forest types or different research sites, different places that have something rooted in the science behind forest science and forest climate science. And giving foresters and practitioners and landowners, when they choose to show up, a chance to really have deep conversations together, look at the science in the field in different forest types, and get a sense of what are things that practitioners can take home. And we've also added in voices from our Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, and also from our district foresters that work with private landowners. So just how do you take this science and make it practical and accessible to folks? So I'll stop there. I think you probably want to ask Peter and Dean more questions, but I'm also happy to answer questions additionally as well.
And Amanda, thank you. In the chat, you answered a question about how we define climate smarter forestry as practices that help forests to mitigate climate change in order to become more adapted and more resilient in the face of climate change. And we specifically called it climate smarter forestry instead of climate smart forestry, because if you say climate smart forestry, it sort of implies that there's also climate dumb forestry. And we wanted to make sure that people understand that there's a continuum here, and we can work across a continuum to do better at mitigation and at adaptation.
And to add to that, I think a second reason for adding the ER, which is not worth fighting over, is if you say climate smart, it could create the misconception that climate is your only goal. And we all know that forestry toward a single goal does not usually turn out well. And so we feel strongly that climate is a very important issue, but it's one of many things that we need to be focused on in our stewardship. So that's why we've just chosen to quietly add the ER.
And we had a couple comments coming in, but we also had a hand raised. I think Micah raised his hand first, so we'll go to Micah next.
Hi, thanks. Sorry I'm not on camera for everyone, but I'm catching this excellent presentation between meetings here. So you may hear some traffic going by, apologies. But first off, thank you all for hosting this and for sharing the results of the report. It's really interesting. I'm with Sustainable Northwest, which is a Portland-based conservation natural resource management organization, and we're a part of a group called the Climate Smart Wood Group, which may be known to some of you and hopefully will be known to more of you over time. But I had the pleasure of hearing from Xander after we landed a pretty large USDA grant from the bipartisan infrastructure law that is essentially picking up where this report leaves off. So one, I'm really glad to be able to hang my hat on a report like this. And then two, to be able to say that group, which you can find at climatesmartwood.net, and I'll drop that in the chat along with my email, is really intending to be a vector and define some of the pathways to recognize and trace wood from forests that are achieving these goals into the green building sector and better quantify what the impacts are along not just carbon, but some of these resiliency and rural economies metrics as well. So that's a big work in progress. The group just at Green Build 2 weeks ago debuted that website. So we're really trying to build network around that, and there's a lot more coming. So I'll save the rest of my shameless plug for anybody who wants to reach out, but I'd be happy to be engaged with this group and anybody here. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in, Micah.
Yeah, that's a great connection, and I think really highlights some of the collaboration that Peter and Dean kind of mentioned early on. Now we're getting more comments and questions coming in. Philip Calloway asked, do you think there are good proposals coming out of Natural and Working Lands Group directed by the Oregon Global Climate Warming Commission?
I'd say absolutely. I think they're doing very important work, and we've been working in cooperation with the commission, and hopefully these pieces can fit well together. And there's a good bit of cross-pollination between the individuals who are involved in all of these different efforts.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the things that I do in my role in the Soil and Water Conservation District is not just work with folks on forestry issues, but also agricultural issues and even urban issues. And I think the Oregon Global Warming Commission work on natural climate solutions gives a lot of good information about, I don't know, there are practices that are sort of a hybrid between agriculture and forestry, like planting hedgerows and wetland restoration projects or riparian forest buffer establishment. So the work that the Global Warming Commission is doing, pointing out that a really good way to sequester carbon on agricultural lands is to plant trees on some of those areas that are maybe less productive for crops, or maybe more important for protecting some other resource like streams and rivers.
Great. let's see, Brenda McComb added in a comment with a website for the adaptation workbook. And yeah, I agree that there are some great tools there. And that's linked to some of the work that Amanda was talking about. The NIAX group from the Forest Service is one of the progenitors of some of that work. And that links into Chris Kenny's question: is the Forest Service a good resource to assist in climate smarter planning, specifically around topics like sentinel trees and focusing on incorporating climate future tree species in the landscape that could be part of a formal stewardship plan? I'll butt in here a little bit, that we're going to be having a follow-up webinar probably in late January, featuring some work from the Forest Service. They also happen to be Forest Stewards Guild members, which is why I heard about it, but they've got some new work around a scientific paper that I actually haven't read yet on assisted migration. So if you're interested, particularly in that sort of element, that topic, keep your eyes open for a Guild webinar in late January. Brian Palick will be sort of leading that. But I think almost all of these topics that we've touched on can be their own sort of full conversation. But Peter, Dean, do you want to comment on Forest Service and their resources?
I might add one thing there, which is we invited many more people than were able to participate, and there's some significant gaps, either because people weren't available or whatever. But with 60% of Oregon's forests being federal forests, the Forest Service and the BLM are a major player in this, and that was a shortcoming on our part, that they weren't involved in this process. But they have been involved on down the line, and I'm pleased to see that Robin Derbyshire is tuned in here. And I know with the Forest Service having responsibility not just for federal lands, but they're active in encouraging good stewardship all across the landscape. Not to put you on the spot, Robin, but if you wanted to surface and add any thoughts about the role of the Forest Service in any of this now and going forward, we welcome your thoughts and we appreciate you tuning in.
Well, I'm not sure how much I could add on a really big topic in a short period of time, but certainly the scale, that we deal with is pretty large, and that adds to the complexity of it. As someone else mentioned, maybe it was you, Peter, single kind of focus management, where, all for carbon sequestration, all for timber production, all for whatever, tends to not work out as well as we'd hoped. So, we're dealing with a multiple use mandate, and a wide variety of sites and a wide variety of management objectives, which really can make things very challenging. Anyway, happy to be part of the conversations with you, and interested always in hearing what other people are thinking as well.
Great. Well, thanks for being on. I want to go to Laura Taylor, who's had her hand up.
Sharing all this, can you hear me?
You're a bit faint. Maybe if you can get nearer the mic or just kind of yell.
Okay. Yeah, my mic is weird. Anyway, I was wondering, so it seems like a lot of the research here was based on the sort of opinions or gut feelings of the different groups, the people in the group. And I'm wondering, are you interested in kind of comparing the perceived importance of different things with maybe what research is telling us, or cross-referencing those in any way?
I would say absolutely. And that's a completely logical step to take. And if people have ideas on how to make that happen, we'd be excited to learn more.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. That's a great comment, and good to see you as always. And and we have been talking with folks from the Oregon Global Warming Commission and the Nature Conservancy and the work that they've done on natural climate solutions.
Also, one other thing that relates to that I meant to say and didn't is there was a very strong caveat, particularly from practitioners, that all strategies aren't going to work equally well all across the landscape or be appropriate. And they really wanted to have the disclaimer saying the strategies are dependent on the context that the person's operating in and their values and priorities. So I completely agree with what you're encouraging. And at the same time, I think if part of this is meeting land managers where they are and helping them change, certainly learning the science underneath it is important, but also how do you blend that with what they're motivated to do? So it seems like they're both important in figuring out going forward, how do we be informed by both of those things?
And let's see, we've got a vote of confidence from Philip, who's just wanted to say they'd be very interested in participating in an Oregon Climate Smarter Forestry Network. So that's great. And let's see, I see Brenda, you're unmuted. Did you want to speak up?
Yeah, thanks, Xander. I just to Laura's point, I think that's just a great point, and I really second that point. I see two different avenues here for research to intersect with what's being proposed here. One is seeing if the opinions represented in this exercise that Peter and Dean ran mesh with the scientific information. So basically vetting the two, see if there's concordance. And the other is calling for social science research to be able to understand the views on this topic more broadly, and then be able to extrapolate that to different sectors of our discipline, our society.
Yeah, I agree. I think we definitely need to look at both these sort of sets of data that we collected in the workshops, which are opinions and viewpoints with more rigorous physical scientific evidence, and a couple places where I think that really stood out in the workshops. One was with the carbon offsets, where there was we like I said before, we tried to not open the workshops up to debate because we were on a timeline and we just wanted to get information instead of having a debate back and forth. But there was a lot of question about just what is a verifiable way of measuring carbon sequestration, and the whole question of additionality, whether there's actually people engaging in offset trading are providing additional mitigation. So that was one, and then another one was the question of wood products. And if you look at research in terms of looking at whether you want a 40-year rotation of Western Oregon forest with Douglas fir or an 80-year rotation, and which is better at sequestering carbon, some of that, or a very important part of that, is how much of the wood products that are produced will displace concrete and steel from buildings. And that's a question that I think can be teased out a bit, with some more rigorous scientific kinds of research, because that's an important question. Just how much displacement is there going to be?
Actually, adding one thing to your great suggestions, Brenda, is absolutely, I think there's a place for the Western science to inform this more fully. And I think there's a piece for the traditional ecological knowledge piece of it. And I mentioned that there are a number of holes in our participation. And one is we invited a number of people involved in tribal forestry who have shown interest, but one participant was from the Siletz tribe. And since then, we've had a chance to get input from Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. But but I think that's another dimension of this conversation that's important and bears more attention and more involvement.
Yeah, that's a great point, Peter. I want to call attention to another comment in the chat window from Lindsay, who says, for those who are interested, the research station for the Pacific Northwest and the U.S. Forest Service's Brad St. Clair have been contributing to some land manager decision-making about seedling selection. So you can follow that link to read a little article more about that. Another key element here. And I guess, oh, good, we have another comment. I'll resist butting in then. We have a comment about an article that talks about the impacts of forests on net zero pledges, especially the substitution of wood for steel and concrete globally. And they're, yeah, it's touching on some issues that we've been debating within the Forest Stewards Guild around carbon offset credits, and what, based on our members' experience, research, and understanding, makes a viable carbon offset credit. And to Dean's point earlier, additionality, verifiable additionality is really important. And I think that, well, there've been a lot in the news lately about some pretty big investments in forest carbon offset credits. There's also been a lot of sort of cold water being thrown on at least some of those credits or some of the ideas around them. And I think it's some of those, the questions can be answered with some science, but I think there are also some sort of societal value questions that are maybe a little harder to get at from a scientific standpoint. Let's see, Klaus adds another quick comment on his way out here, and I guess we should be wrapping up. One missed opportunity I see is apparently no one is documenting any assisted migration efforts people are undertaking. Yeah, really important, because if we're going to be doing assisted migration, we really need to track how it's working and what's actually happening. And that's true probably with all our efforts. I think there's probably a lot of climate smarter forestry that is happening sort of at the landowner scale that may not be super well documented and limiting our ability to learn from it. So maybe that's a good role for the climate smarter forestry network.
And actually a related thing there that surprised me is an obvious question that nobody asked here is the relationship between the bar graphs from the combined groups versus what we heard from the practitioners. And one thing that jumped out to me was that tied for third place was learning more about assisted migration. So I think that was interesting that I mean, it's a small sample size, but clearly it's on people's mind. And I think there's a lot of concern and need for care, but also an awareness that the world is changing around us quickly. So thank you, Klaus.
Well, and maybe here we should wrap up. We're just about at the top of the hour again. I think from my perspective at the Guild, this is obviously central to our interest in our work. And so we'll be looking for ways that we can add a positive contribution, whether it's through sort of follow-up webinars like the one on assisted migration we're planning. So if you have ideas, places where you can see the role of a nonprofit being useful or contributing to the Climate Smart Wood effort, please do let me know or let Peter or Dean know. And I think we're all in this together, so I am eager to, whether or not it's a formal network, continue this conversation. I think it can't stop here. Peter or Dean, do you have other comments or closeout?
I have one final thought I'd share. Again, thank you to everyone for being here, and thank you, Xander. And that one thing that we didn't go into is the wide span of participants. So we had people all the way from Beyond Toxics and Bark and the Sunrise PDX group, to Stimson Lumber Company and some very, hardcore small woodland people. So a quote I ran into recently caught my attention on this. It said, "Our political system has lost its ability to reconcile differences or to even try." And in response to that, I'd say that, our experience since June suggests that based on a small cross section of Oregonians, the opposite is the case, that not only are they willing, but they're eager. And that, yes, there are differences, but that doesn't mean we can't work together. So again, it's a tiny experiment, but I think it shows that Oregonians are not just willing, but keen to figure out how do we work together to find the common ground to move ahead. And I think there's much, much more common ground than we thought there would be. And there's an awful lot that we can work with. And I think we're kind of challenging all of our leaders and all of us to figure out how do we move from talking about this to actually creating an environment that allows people to do what they would like to do in their forest management.
Yeah, I would echo that, Peter. And I think with that diversity of people who really are interested in this, there is an openness to new ideas that I saw in these workshops. And like many kinds of workshops or events, you learn a lot in between presentations. So being in a carpool with people, going through the forest and hearing their ideas about what we had just talked about as a group was really interesting and not what you would expect. So I was in one car in one group with two people who are small woodland owners who were very skeptical about carbon offset trading, even though theoretically that might provide them with a flow of income. And I was in another group in a carpool with people who were, I guess maybe you could classify them as timber industry management organization type organizations who were really positive about carbon offset trading. So very interesting and open communication that we saw here. That was very heartening.
Great. Well, that's a great note to end on. And thanks everybody for participating. And I hope to see you on future webinars, or actually even better, maybe in the woods. So thanks everybody.